back to another episode of I Wish They Knew, a show where we share big ideas that deserve more attention in about the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. I'm Joe Hirsch. Today's wish comes from Tamsen Webster. Tamsen is a keynote speaker and idea strategist who helps leaders craft their case for large-scale change. She's a judge and a mentor for the Harvard Innovation Labs, professional advisor at the Martin Trust Center for MIT Entrepreneurship, and spent over 10 years as the idea strategist and executive producer, one of the only legacy-level TEDx events in the world. Pretty awesome. I know those events, and I know those speakers, and she did a great job. In 2022, Tamsen was named to the Thinkers 50 Radar list, and she's the author of 2 books, Find Your Red Thread, Make Your Big Ideas Irresistible, and her latest, Say What They Can't Unhear, the 9 Principles of Lasting Change, due out this coming October. Tamsen, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Joe. I'm delighted. Thanks for bringing me here. Well, obviously I'm so excited. I'm speechless. So here we go.
Well, we're going to change that real quick. Not your excitement, but your speech, because you've got a lot to say about change. Tell us what you wish more people knew when it came to managing.
Oh man, I like to say, I started my career with a brief but enduring turn as a change management consultant. And what I wish people knew is that many, if not most, of the approaches that we use to inspiring change, stewarding change, making change happen, actually work against it.
So it's fair to say that the only constant with change is that people are relating to it.
Exactly.
It's always going to change, and people are going to change the way they relate to it.
That's right.
So as a result, we're not really just handling one process of change, but many and many movements, many fronts at once. Knowing all that, how can we make that change feel more tailored and personal for people?
Well, I think one of the key things is to make sure that change always is anchored in a goal you and the other people, your audience, your stakeholders share. That's how you make it personal, is that you find a place where your desires and theirs intersect. And that's critical, because if you cannot find a way to legitimately connect a change that you're asking for to something that somebody actively and knowingly wants, they may go along to get along, but you're never going to have them really support and actively help you implement that change.
What I found really interesting about the way you constructed this book is that you break down those different groups into 4 specific audiences. Walk us through those and help us understand what a change agent might be up against when dealing with those different audiences.
So the thing to understand about these 4 audiences for change is that anytime a change is introduced, it creates some kind of dissonance, some kind of discomfort, mental discomfort, because as much as change happens all the time, our brain spends a lot of time trying to keep everything the same. So people tend to have one of 4 reactions to that change. The one that we're all relieved for is what I call the actives. Those are the people who hear that change and they immediately connect with what it's going to do for them. They share the outcome that it's going to produce. And importantly, they share and align with how that outcome is going to be achieved. They agree with not only why we're doing it, but how we're doing it too. At the other end would be the antagonists. Those are the ones to watch out for. Those are the folks that not only get that initial dissonance, but they snap into what's known as reactance or even rejection of the idea. Those are the folks that are protesters. They are often vocal protesters. So that's really important. They're an important group to pay attention to, because it is possible to change how they think about a change, but you certainly can't ignore that. Now, the 2 in the middle, I think, are really interesting, because a lot of times I think people just think, well, there's a middle. And it's interesting, as I was developing this book, I had to fight for the fact that there's actually 2 in the middle. Now, one is what I call the ambivalence. So think of these folks as the skeptics for a change. They're folks that feel that dissonance, but that dissonance doesn't immediately resolve one way or another. And that's because they care about the outcome of the change, but they care about something else, let's say, equally as much. So they say, I want what this is going to do, but I also want nothing to change. And that ambivalence can keep them in a state of what feels like indecisiveness or flip-flop to you, but it's actually really important because that indicates their openness to more information that will help them flip one way or the other. People don't like to be in that state of tension, and so they really want help tipping. The last group are the indifferents. They don't care. They literally do not care. You say the change and they're like, yeah, okay, whatever. It I don't hate it. I don't love it. These are definitely folks that are going to go along to get along. It's possible to get them more engaged, but they aren't going to work against you. So they're kind of the least important to focus on. But they are different from the ambivalence because the indifferents don't care and the ambivalents do. They just care about something else equally as much.
So for your actives, you want to bring them in early, bring them in as those early adopters. For the ones who are completely antagonistic, you probably can't do much except dodge for cover.
Your actives have a potential to be advocates for you. Particularly if you equip them with an effective argument for change, they can be additional bodies to help convert the ambivalence, maybe some indifference, and the antagonists as well. I would say your most important focus immediately is to make sure that you've neutralized any of the antagonism. Move them to a point where at least they can stage into ambivalence. Just say, okay, a lot of times they just need to be heard and they need to hear how their approach can or can't be included in what you're doing. But then I think where there's a huge amount of power and where I think truly the success of a potential change initiative lies is in how you talk to the ambivalence. Those folks that are really trying to figure out which way they're going to go. And you have to understand those antagonists, they're going to have some, again, they can be just as vocal as your actives. So it really comes down to who can make the better case for their position. And that's where really paying attention to how you frame a message of change, how you argue for it, and not like combatively, but really make that case for it comes into play.
So on the change front, it sounds like you have an opportunity to build coalitions,
Yes.
create change champions with your actives. You have a responsibility, maybe even an obligation, a quick obligation to neutralize the opposition from those antagonists,
Yep.
and then win over more ambivalence and possibly even the indifference by providing more information. So I guess as a strategy, where should leaders who are leading these change efforts spend their effort? I imagine it's not just a matter of time, but also focus and value.
Yeah. And I would say that the more you focus and value, the more you can get to a point of actually saving time. That's what I'm finding in the approach that I espouse in my book. And that is really understanding where are the shared goals and what are the shared principles and beliefs upon which everyone can agree and which support the change. And what's interesting is it doesn't require a huge amount of time to articulate. It may take some time to actually find those things because we're human. And a lot of times we can't imagine why someone else doesn't immediately see the same value in a change that we do. But we know why that happens. It's a cognitive bias called the false consensus effect, where we just believe that everybody sees the world the same way. So by taking what otherwise would be implicit assumptions about why a change makes sense and make them explicit, you end up tapping into those shared values. You end up tapping into those deeper elements of an argument or a case for change that people need in order to understand it. And you end up doing it a lot more quickly and getting right to the point so that you can identify where those misalignments or misunderstandings are.
So there are things that we can do to help make this change process smoother and more effective, but there's a lot of things that we're doing to actually get in our own way. And that's really one of the most important parts about this book that I love.
Yes.
So tell me about how we're undermining that change process.
So I think one of the biggest things that we're doing to undermine the change process is that we are challenging people's beliefs. And it makes sense on one level. If we need someone to change and we know that there are beliefs that they have that are getting in the way, or there are beliefs that we know they need for them to support us, we're like, well, let's tell them what they need to believe. Let's change their beliefs. Okay. Unfortunately, the neuroscience of change works against you in two directions. One is that people hold on to the beliefs they already have, which is part of what you're trying to overcome in the first place. But that means it's really hard to get them to adopt any new belief, particularly one that goes directly against that belief that they've held long term. The second way it works against you is, let's say that they just say yes, either to get you to stop talking or to preserve some kind of, image they want you to have of them. But in a battle of beliefs, which is eventually going to happen when they have to put this change into place, that new belief is going to lose every time to the older, stronger belief that was already there. So one of the big shifts that I think can just make a transformational difference in your ability to help steward change is, instead of trying to challenge people's beliefs, exchange the belief that you're using as the basis of your argument for another deeper one that they already have. So you're looking for a stronger belief than the one that's standing in the way.
Right. Give us an example of that, if you can.
Sure. Yeah. So if you're saying, for instance, so one of the examples I use in the book is let's say there's a heated discussion at a local school board meeting about increasing funding for the schools, and you've got one side that's like, oh, it's because of mismanagement. You're all going to benefit from this, and another side that's like, you're killing our children. And let's say that somebody comes up and says, all right, listen, I believe, right, that every child in our community deserves the best possible education we can give for them. I believe that the more attention that any child gives, the better that it gets and is going to be. And so that's why I'm in support of the funding, because it's going to allow our schools to reduce the class sizes and thus give each child more time from their teachers to improve their attention.
So if you go behind the belief,
they go
then
behind
you're
the belief,
able to find the common ground.
find the common ground, rather than saying, let me argue this position or that one. Just say, listen, I'm going to keep digging. I like to call these bedrock beliefs until I find something that I'm fairly sure that both you and I agree on. But here's where it's really important for leaders, because sometimes you will find a belief that you can't resolve. And that actually tells you whether or not you will ever be able to get that person on board. And I, as a leader and the work that I do with leaders, I would rather know that up front. Let's really find out where it is that we do or don't agree and don't align at that baseline principle level, so that we can really see what our path forward could be.
So you've identified your audience. You've tried to find the common ground by going behind that message, behind that belief. But what does a compelling change message actually sound like? Because in order to give us the outcomes that they want and the change that we want, we really have to bring those two into alignment. And that's really a matter of how it's messaged, right?
The simplest, strongest argument that you can make for anything is to say, if concept or principle number one is true, and you agree that principle number two is true, then you will logically agree that a conclusion that combines those two things will also be true. You will also agree with that. And so that is what I see over and over again. That's what I've seen over and over again with the messaging I've developed with my clients, with the messaging I've developed with our TEDx New England speakers, is that when you can first anchor a message in something your stakeholders actively and knowingly want, right? You're looking for a persistent irritant, an urgent issue, something that they're not going to unwant. That's a real key part. We need to build an argument for that idea based on what the folks that we're talking to have already bought into. We're going to base it on things they already want and things that they already believe. And when we do that, what we can do is we actually are making the case for something that's unfamiliar based on things that are already both familiar and desired. And that's what makes a compelling case for change.
So it's not about forcing that change. It's about finding the agreement.
It is. Yeah. And so I say this often, that this is not an invention. This is not figuring out what I can say to get someone to agree. This is a process of excavation. Why do I believe at my core that this is the right change to make? And, sometimes people are in the position of, having to steward a change that they didn't choose. This is also a key thing. It's just basically say, can you do the work to find for yourself a way to argue for this that you actually believe in? Because if you can't, no one's ever going to believe in a change more than the person talking about it. So if you can't really get behind it for reasons that you can articulate in a way that other people can understand, they can't possibly get to a point where they understand well enough to agree and eventually adopt the change.
The author and idea strategist is Tamsen Webster, and I'm ready to change my views on change as a result of this conversation. Tamsen, thanks for sharing your wish with
My
us tonight.
pleasure.